Wyoming Territory, 1884. The first sign of trouble appeared on a Tuesday morning, scuffed boots and a tattered dress climbing the hill to Bryce Vance's modest ranch house. The child couldn't have been more than 8, her brown hair hanging in 2 messy braids, her determined march up the dusty path at odds with her small frame. Bryce watched her approach from his porch, wondering what business a little girl could possibly have with him. "Mr. Rancher, sir?" Her voice carried across the yard before she'd even reached the steps. "I need your help. My mama needs your help." Bryce set down his coffee mug, a fresh-faced young man of 24 with sun-browned skin and wheat-colored hair that curled slightly at his collar. His lean frame was the product of long days in the saddle, strong without being bulky, and the light stubble on his jaw couldn't hide the fact that he was still more boy than man in many ways. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, descending the steps to meet her. "Eliza Wilson, sir." She performed a small, awkward curtsy that someone had clearly taught her. "My mama's Lillian Wilson. She works at the Silver Dollar in town." Bryce felt a flicker of recognition at the name. The Silver Dollar was one of Wheatland's more notorious establishments, not the worst of the saloons, but certainly not a place where respectable women found employment. He'd glimpsed her once or twice during his infrequent trips to town, a beautiful woman with honey-gold hair who looked decidedly out of place among the painted ladies and hard-eyed barmaids. "And what makes you think I can help your mother?" Bryce asked gently. Eliza lifted her chin with a determination that seemed too weighty for her small shoulders. "Because Mr. Jenkins at the general store said you're looking to hire a housekeeper since your ma passed, and my mama can cook and clean better than anybody. And," here her voice wavered slightly, "she shouldn't have to work at that place. The men there are mean, and she cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." Bryce felt something twist in his chest. His mother had indeed passed 3 months prior, leaving him alone on the small ranch his father had built before falling to fever 5 years earlier. He'd mentioned to Jenkins that the place was becoming unmanageable for a bachelor, but he hadn't seriously considered hiring help. "Does your mother know you're here?" he asked. Eliza's gaze dropped to her worn boots. "No, sir. She's sleeping now. She works late." "I see." Bryce crouched down to her eye level. "Where's your pa?" "He died when I was little. In the war." The simplicity of her statement stood in stark contrast to the gravity of its meaning. Bryce nodded slowly. "Tell you what, Miss Eliza. How about you and I ride into town and speak with your mother properly? This isn't the kind of thing a young lady should be arranging on her own." The relief on her face was palpable. "You'll help her then?" "I'll hear what she has to say," Bryce amended, unwilling to make promises he might not keep. "Wait here while I saddle my horse." As he walked toward the barn, Bryce considered the strange turn his morning had taken. He'd been managing fine on his own, or so he told himself. The truth was the cabin had grown lonelier since his mother's passing, the silence more oppressive, the meals hastily prepared and eaten without joy. But hiring Lillian Wilson, a woman from the Silver Dollar? That would set tongues wagging from here to Cheyenne. Still, the thought of a child desperate enough to climb the hill to his ranch, to beg a stranger for help, settled uncomfortably in his gut. Whatever else Lillian Wilson might be, she was clearly a mother loved deeply by her daughter. Lillian Wilson's modest rental cabin sat on the outskirts of town, far enough from the saloon district to maintain some respectability. When she opened the door, her eyes widened first with confusion, then with horror as she recognized both her daughter and the tall young rancher standing behind her. "Eliza, where have you?" Her gaze snapped to Bryce, golden hair tumbling around shoulders draped in a simple blue dress that spoke of better days. "Mr. Vance. I don't understand." She was even more beautiful up close than Bryce had remembered. Her face was uncommonly fine, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of summer sage. Despite the early hour and obvious surprise, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her rumored profession. "Your daughter paid me a visit this morning," Bryce explained, tipping his hat politely. "She seemed to think I might be in need of a housekeeper." Color rushed to Lillian's cheeks as she pulled Eliza close. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Vance. My daughter has an overactive imagination and should know better than to bother strangers." She bent to Eliza's level, her voice stern but gentle. "Go inside and wait for me, young lady. We'll discuss this later." Once Eliza had reluctantly disappeared inside, Lillian straightened, smoothing her dress with nervous hands. "Please forgive the intrusion. I assure you it won't happen again. No harm done, Bryce said, studying her more carefully. Up close, he could see the shadows beneath her eyes, the weariness that her natural beauty couldn't quite disguise. Though I must admit, your daughter made a compelling case. Lillian's expression tightened. I don't know what she told you, but we're managing just fine. She mentioned you work at the Silver Dollar. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lillian's chin lifted a fraction, pride evident in every line of her body. I serve drinks and play the piano, Mr. Vance. Nothing more. The firmness in her voice dared him to suggest otherwise. It's not what I'd choose, but it keeps a roof over our heads and food on our table. Bryce nodded, unexpectedly chastened by her quiet dignity. As it happens, I am looking for help at the ranch. My mother passed recently, and the place isn't what it should be. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly, and he could tell she meant it. But I can't accept charity, especially not arranged by my 8-year-old daughter. It wouldn't be charity, Mrs. Wilson. It would be employment. Room and board for you and Eliza, plus wages. He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure why he was pressing the issue. The ranch is small but growing. 20 head of cattle, some chickens, a decent vegetable garden my mother started. It needs a woman's touch. Lillian studied him, wariness evident in her gaze. People will talk. People always talk, Bryce countered. But you'd have your own cabin, the old foreman's quarters. It's small but sound. Better than having to work nights while your daughter sleeps alone. Something flickered across Lillian's face. Hope, perhaps, or simply the weight of her exhaustion. Why would you do this? You don't know me. It was a fair question, one Bryce wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Your daughter reminded me of something my father used to say, that a person's worth isn't in where they are, but in where they're trying to go. For a long moment, Lillian said nothing. Then she glanced back toward the house where Eliza waited. I need to see the place first, and we'd have to be clear about expectations. Of course, I can come back with the wagon tomorrow, show you both the ranch. As he rode back home that afternoon, Bryce wondered what he'd gotten himself into. His neighbors would certainly raise eyebrows at his bringing a saloon woman to live at his ranch, no matter how respectable the arrangement. And yet, the image of Eliza's determined little face and Lillian's quiet dignity stayed with him, making him question when exactly he'd started caring so much about what others thought. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 3 miles east of his property, a stagecoach was arriving in Wheatland carrying a passenger whose presence would soon complicate matters far beyond the raising of neighborly eyebrows. True to his word, Bryce returned the next day with his wagon. Lillian and Eliza were waiting, a small trunk and 2 carpet bags holding the sum total of their worldly possessions. As they rode toward the ranch, Eliza chattered excitedly about the prospect of animals and open spaces, while Lillian remained quiet, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It's not much, Bryce said as they crested the final hill, revealing the modest but well-kept ranch sprawling before them. A 2-story main house built of sturdy logs stood at the center, flanked by a barn, corral, and several smaller outbuildings. But it's good land. It's beautiful, Lillian murmured, and something in her voice made Bryce glance at her. For the first time since they'd met, her face had relaxed, the worried line between her brows smoothing as she took in the rolling pastures and distant mountains. He showed them to the foreman's cabin first, a 1-room structure with a small lean-to addition. It was simple but sound, with a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a curtained-off sleeping area. A narrow cot could be placed in the lean-to for Eliza. It needs airing out, Bryce apologized, but the roof doesn't leak, and the stove draws well. It's perfect, Lillian said softly, running a hand along the rough-hewn table. Truly. They settled terms over coffee in the main house, room and board plus $12 a month, which was more than fair for housekeeping and cooking. Lillian would have Sundays to herself, and Eliza would be welcome to attend the small school in town once the term started again in autumn. I should tell you, Lillian said carefully as they finished their discussion, that there may be talk about my previous employment. Bryce nodded. I figured as much. I want to be clear, Mr. Vance. Despite what people might say, I've never been. She glanced at Eliza, who was examining a collection of carved wooden animals on the mantel, then lowered her voice. I've never been that kind of woman. I served drinks and played piano. Nothing more. The earnestness in her eyes made it impossible not to believe her. "Your reputation doesn't concern me, Mrs. Wilson. Your work will speak for itself." Relief washed over her face, and for a moment, Bryce caught a glimpse of how truly beautiful she was when unburdened by worry. It left him momentarily speechless. "When would you like us to start?" she asked, breaking the silence. "How about today? Unless you need more time to settle your affairs in town." Lillian smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Mr. Vance, I've been praying for a chance to leave that place since the day I started. There's nothing to settle." That evening, after helping them move in and ensuring they had everything they needed for the night, Bryce returned to his empty house with an odd sense of anticipation. Change had come suddenly to his quiet existence, and while he wasn't entirely sure what to make of it, he couldn't deny a certain lightening of his spirit at the thought of voices and activity returning to the ranch that had grown too quiet since his mother's death. What he couldn't have anticipated was how swiftly Lillian Wilson would transform not only his home, but the subtle rhythms of his days. By the end of the week, the main house gleamed with a cleanliness it hadn't seen in months. Meals appeared on the table at regular hours, not just edible but delicious, prepared with a care that reminded him of his mother's cooking. Eliza proved equally industrious, gathering eggs each morning and helping to tend the kitchen garden with surprising capability for one so young. More surprising still was how naturally they seemed to fit into the empty spaces of the ranch, as though they'd been meant to be there all along. Bryce found himself lingering over breakfast, making excuses to return to the house for midday dinner rather than eating cold biscuits in the fields. He began to notice small details, the way Lillian hummed while she worked, how the Wyoming sun brought out golden highlights in her hair, the gentle patience with which she instructed Eliza. It was during the second week that he realized he was in danger of developing feelings that went well beyond employer and employee. The recognition came suddenly, as he watched Lillian hanging laundry on the line, laughing at something Eliza had said, her face tilted toward the sun. The sight created a longing so acute it almost hurt, not just for her, but for the family he'd never thought he wanted until that moment. The realization troubled him. Lillian had made it clear she was accepting a position, not charity, and certainly not courtship. She'd been adamant about maintaining propriety, keeping a careful distance that Bryce respected. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel that his offer of employment had ulterior motives. So he buried the feelings, focusing instead on the practical benefits of having help around the ranch. And if he sometimes found his gaze lingering on Lillian longer than was strictly necessary, or if his heart quickened when their hands accidentally touched passing the salt at supper, well, that was his burden to bear. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in small communities. And Bryce's growing affection for his housekeeper wouldn't remain private for long, particularly when the stagecoach passenger who had arrived the same day as Lillian finally made his presence known. The first hint of trouble appeared in the form of Harlan Jenkins, the general store owner, who arrived at the ranch one Saturday morning with his monthly delivery of supplies. As Bryce helped unload sacks of flour and coffee, Jenkins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Here you've got yourself some help up here," he said, eyes darting toward the house where Lillian could be seen through the window, kneading bread dough. "That's right," Bryce replied evenly. "Mrs. Wilson and her daughter. They're doing fine work." Jenkins fidgeted with his hat. "Some folks in town are wondering about the appropriateness of the arrangement. Woman like that, living on a bachelor's property." Bryce straightened to his full height, fixing Jenkins with a hard stare. "Mrs. Wilson is my housekeeper. She and her daughter have their own cabin. There's nothing inappropriate about it." Course not, Jenkins backpedaled. "Just passing along what I've heard. No offense meant." He hesitated, then added, "Though you might want to know, there's a fellow been asking questions about her. Eastern type, fancy clothes. Been staying at the hotel for near 2 weeks now." This was unexpected news. Did he give a name? Called himself Barrett. Said he represented some banking interests. Jenkins shrugged. Seemed mighty interested in Mrs. Wilson's whereabouts for a banker. After Jenkins departed, Bryce found himself troubled by the information. Lillian hadn't mentioned expecting anyone from back east, nor had she spoken much about her past at all. Who was this Barrett, and what did he want with her? He debated whether to mention it to Lillian, finally deciding that she had a right to know. That evening, after Eliza had been tucked into bed, He invited Lillian to sit on the porch of the main house, offering her a cup of the cherry cordial his mother had put up the previous summer. Jenkins mentioned something interesting today. He began carefully, watching her profile in the fading light. Said there's a man in town asking about you. Eastern fellow named Barrett. The change that came over Lillian was immediate and alarming. The color drained from her face, and her hands began to tremble so violently that cordial sloshed over the rim of her cup. Lillian? What is it? He's found me, she whispered, more to herself than to Bryce. Dear God, he's found me again. Bryce moved closer, resisting the urge to take her hand. Who is Barrett? What does he want with you? For a long moment, Lillian said nothing, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow with old fear. His name is Edgar Barrett. He's a businessman from Chicago, or that's what he calls himself. In truth, he owns gambling halls and worse. She took a shaky breath. And he believes he owns me as well. Owns you? Bryce echoed, confusion giving way to alarm. How could any man, my late husband, owed him money? A great deal of money. Lillian's hands twisted in her lap. After James died, Barrett came to collect. When I couldn't pay, he offered an alternative arrangement. Said I could work off the debt in one of his establishments. The implications turned Bryce's stomach. And you refused. I took Eliza and ran instead. We've been moving west ever since, staying nowhere more than a few months. I thought Wyoming was far enough. Her voice cracked. I should have known better. Did he hurt you? Bryce asked, his throat tight with a rage he could barely contain. Lillian shook her head. Not physically, but his threats were very clear about what would happen if I didn't cooperate. And the silver dollar? A compromise, she said bitterly. I couldn't find respectable work without references, but I refused to do what Barrett wanted. Playing piano in a saloon was the best I could manage. Bryce sat back, processing this new information. It explained so much. Her wariness, her fierce protection of Eliza, her desperation to leave town. He can't force you to go with him, Bryce said firmly. You're not property to be claimed. You don't understand. He's a powerful man with connections. He'll create some legal pretext, unpaid debts, theft, whatever it takes. Her eyes, when they met his, were bright with unshed tears. And he always gets what he wants. Without thinking, Bryce reached for her hand. Not this time, he promised. Not while I have anything to say about it. Lillian looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. Something passed between them in that moment. A current of understanding, of trust tentatively offered and received. I should have told you, she whispered. Before you hired me. Before I brought this trouble to your door. You've brought nothing but good to this ranch, Bryce countered. And I mean to make sure you and Eliza can stay as long as you wish. What he didn't say, couldn't say yet, was how the prospect of them leaving had become unthinkable to him. How in just 2 short weeks, they had become essential to his happiness in a way he couldn't quite explain. As Lillian returned to her cabin that night, Bryce remained on the porch, watching her slender figure disappear into the darkness. One thing was certain. Edgar Barrett would have to go through him to get to Lillian Wilson. And Bryce Vance, for all his youth and inexperience, was not a man to be trifled with when it came to protecting those he cared about. What he couldn't know was that Barrett had already set his plan in motion, a plan that would test not only Bryce's determination but the fragile trust beginning to bloom between him and Lillian. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Bryce returned from town to find an expensive black carriage parked in his yard and a well-dressed stranger standing on his porch, engaged in conversation with a visibly distressed Lillian. Edgar Barrett cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. His tailored suit and gold watch chain spoke of wealth, while the 2 rough-looking men waiting by the carriage suggested he had other means of persuasion at his disposal. Ah, this must be your employer, Barrett said smoothly as Bryce dismounted. His accent carried the polished edges of Eastern education, but his eyes were cold and calculating. We were just discussing Mrs. Wilson's previous obligations. There's nothing to discuss, Bryce replied, moving to stand beside Lillian. Mrs. Wilson is employed here. Whatever business you think you have with her is concluded. Barrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid it's not that simple, young man. Mrs. Wilson's husband left considerable debts that remain unsettled. I've been quite patient, but my generosity has limits. Any legitimate debt can be addressed through proper legal channels, Bryce countered. There's no need for personal visits. How admirable, your concern for propriety. Barrett's gaze swept over the ranch with undisguised contempt. Though I wonder what the good people of Wheatland would say about your living arrangement with a woman of Mrs. Wilson's background. Lillian flinched as if struck. My daughter is inside, she said quietly. Please, not here. Your daughter, Barrett mused. Charming child. It would be a shame if her mother's poor decisions affected her future prospects. The veiled threat hung in the air, ugly and explicit. Bryce felt a surge of fury so powerful it took all his self-control not to physically remove Barrett from his property. I think you should leave, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Barrett checked his pocket watch with exaggerated casualness. I'll be in Wheatland for another week. That should give Mrs. Wilson sufficient time to settle her affairs here. His eyes locked with Lillian's. I've secured positions for both of you in Chicago. Quite generous arrangements, all things considered. She's not going anywhere, Bryce stated flatly. That's not your decision to make. Barrett replaced his watch, adjusting his gloves. Unless, of course, you're prepared to settle her debt yourself. $1,500 would resolve the matter completely. The sum was staggering, more than most ranchers in the territory saw in several years. Barrett knew it was impossible, which made the offer nothing more than a cruel mockery. I'll expect your answer by Sunday, Mrs. Wilson. With a tip of his hat, Barrett descended the steps and returned to his carriage. As it rolled away, Lillian sagged against the porch railing, her face ashen. He threatened Eliza, she whispered. Not directly, but his meaning was clear. Bryce fought to contain his anger. He can't just claim you owe a debt without proof. There are laws that favor men like Barrett, Lillian interrupted. He has documents, promissory notes with James's signature. Some are forged, I'm certain, but how would I prove it? And even if I could, she closed her eyes briefly. He has friends in high places. Judges, officials. He's ruined people who stood against him. So you're considering going with him. It wasn't a question. Lillian's silence was answer enough. There has to be another way, Bryce insisted, unwilling to accept defeat. What if we could raise the money? $1,500 in 5 days? Lillian gave a hollow laugh. Even if it were possible, I couldn't accept such charity. It wouldn't be charity, Bryce said, an idea forming. It would be an investment, a loan against future profits. Lillian looked at him skeptically. What profits? This ranch has potential, Bryce explained, his mind racing ahead. More than I've developed. With the right backing, we could expand the herd, improve the breeding stock. My father always said this land could support 3 times the cattle we're running. No bank would loan that kind of money without collateral. Not a bank. Investors. Bryce paced the porch, his plan taking shape. There's a cattle buyer from Denver staying in town, Nathaniel Cooper. He's been looking for local ranchers to partner with. Said he liked what he saw of my operation when he visited last month. Hope flickered briefly in Lillian's eyes before doubt extinguished it. Even if he agreed, such arrangements take time to finalize. Barrett won't wait. Then we'll buy time, Bryce insisted. Tell Barrett you need proof of the debt. Documentation. Witnesses. Anything to delay while we secure the funding. Lillian studied him, a question in her gaze. Why would you do this, Bryce? Take on debt, risk your ranch. For us? It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice made his heart stumble. There were so many answers he could give, that it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't stand to see Barrett victimize her, that no one deserved to be owned by another. All would have been true, but the fullest truth was simpler and more complicated all at once. Because in the short time you and Eliza have been here, you've made this place feel like home again. And I'm not ready to lose that. Something shifted in Lillian's expression, a softening, a recognition. For a breathless moment, Bryce thought she might step closer, might acknowledge the unspoken current that had been growing between them. Instead, the front door banged open as Eliza burst onto the porch. Mama, I finished all my. She stopped abruptly, sensing the tension. Is something wrong? Lillian quickly composed her features into a reassuring smile. Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Mr. Vance and I were just discussing some ranch business. As Eliza launched into an excited account of the chicken eggs she'd collected, the moment between Bryce and Lillian passed. But something had changed. A truth had been voiced, however obliquely, that couldn't be unacknowledged. Later that night, after Bryce had ridden into town to arrange a meeting with Cooper, Lillian sat at the small table in her cabin, writing by lamplight while Eliza slept. The letter, addressed to the sheriff, detailed everything she knew about Edgar Barrett's operations in Chicago, the gambling, the prostitution, the blackmail of prominent citizens. It was information she'd been too afraid to share before, knowing what Barrett was capable of. If Bryce's plan failed, the letter would be her last resort, a way to fight back, even if it meant risking everything. She sealed it carefully, then hid it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. For the first time in years, Lillian Wilson was done running. Whatever came next, she would face it, not just for Eliza's sake, but for her own. And perhaps, she admitted in the privacy of her heart, for the sake of a young rancher whose kindness had awakened feelings she'd thought long dead. The next morning dawned with a sense of urgency. Bryce rode into town at first light, determined to meet with Nathaniel Cooper before Barrett could further complicate matters. He found the cattle buyer having breakfast at the hotel restaurant, a newspaper spread before him. Cooper was a shrewd businessman in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the cattle trade. He listened attentively as Bryce outlined his proposal, a partnership that would expand the ranch's operations in exchange for immediate capital. "It's an interesting proposition," Cooper said when Bryce finished. "Your ranch has good water rights and decent grazing, but $1,500 is a substantial investment for an unproven operation." "The operation isn't unproven," Bryce countered. "My father ran 60 head on that land for 15 years without a bad season. I've just been cautious about expansion since taking over." Cooper studied him over his coffee cup. "And your sudden interest in rapid growth has nothing to do with your new housekeeper and her troubles with Edgar Barrett?" Bryce stiffened. "How do you know about that?" "Small towns, son. And Barrett isn't exactly subtle." Cooper set down his cup. "I know his type. Made his money through other people's vices and misfortunes." "Then you understand why this is urgent." "I do." Cooper's expression softened slightly. "And I admire your willingness to help the lady. But business and personal matters should remain separate." Bryce leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Mr. Cooper, I'm not asking for charity. The expansion makes sense regardless. I've been too cautious since my father died, and that's held the ranch back. This would be a sound investment for you and the push I need to grow operations properly." Cooper considered this, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "I'll tell you what. I'll advance you $500 today as a show of good faith. The rest will come after proper documentation is drawn up, which will take at least a week." "Barrett won't wait a week," Bryce said, frustration evident in his voice. "500 might buy you time," Cooper suggested. "A partial payment, with promise of the rest to follow." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Bryce nodded his agreement, and they shook hands on the arrangement. As Cooper left to arrange the funds, Bryce tried to formulate a plan for securing the remaining $1,000, a sum that still seemed dauntingly large. He was so preoccupied that he almost didn't notice Sheriff Tanner entering the hotel until the lawman called his name. "Vance. Just the man I was looking for." Tanner was a solid, competent officer who'd been sheriff of Wheatland for nearly a decade. "Got some information you might find interesting about your visitor yesterday." Bryce's attention sharpened. "Barrett." "The very same." Tanner glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Just got a telegraph from the Chicago authorities. Seems Mr. Barrett is wanted for questioning regarding some unsavory business practices. Nothing they can arrest him for yet, but they're building a case." "That's useful to know, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem." "No, but this might." Tanner pulled a folded document from his vest. "Court order from Judge Wilson over in Laramie. Barrett can't remove Mrs. Wilson from the territory while there are questions about the legitimacy of his claims against her." Bryce stared at the paper in disbelief. "How did you manage this?" "Let's just say Barrett has made enemies in high places as well as friends." Tanner handed him the document. "Judge Wilson's son lost everything to Barrett's gambling operations back east. He was quite interested when I mentioned Barrett was trying similar tactics here." For the first time since Barrett's arrival, Bryce felt a flicker of genuine hope. "This buys us time, but Barrett won't give up easily." "No, he won't," Tanner agreed grimly. "Which is why Mrs. Wilson should consider providing a formal statement about Barrett's operations." The Chicago authorities are particularly interested in first-hand accounts. The suggestion aligned perfectly with what Lillian had written in her letter. Perhaps, with legal backing and distance from Barrett's influence, she might finally be willing to step forward. I'll speak with her, Bryce promised. And Sheriff, thank you. Armed with Cooper's financial commitment and the court order, Bryce rode back to the ranch with renewed determination. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it seemed they had a fighting chance against Barrett's machinations. What he didn't anticipate was that Barrett, facing unexpected resistance, would resort to more desperate and dangerous measures to get what he wanted. Bryce returned to the ranch to find Lillian hanging laundry, her movements betraying the tension she was clearly trying to hide from Eliza, who was feeding the chickens nearby. When she saw him, relief flooded her features. "Any news?" she asked quietly as he approached. "Good news, actually." He quickly explained about Cooper's investment and the court order, watching as hope cautiously dawned in her eyes. "So Barrett can't force me to leave with him?" "Not legally," Bryce confirmed. "And Sheriff Tanner mentioned the Chicago authorities are building a case against him. Your testimony could help." Lillian glanced toward Eliza, then back to Bryce. "I've been considering that. I even wrote down everything I know, in case." She didn't finish the thought. "This changes things," Bryce said. "With the court order and Cooper's initial investment, we can stall Barrett until the full funding comes through. Once your debt is paid, assuming it's even legitimate, he'll have no claim on you." Lillian reached out impulsively, squeezing his hand. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Bryce said softly. "Just stay." Something unspoken passed between them, a current of feeling neither was quite ready to name. Lillian's fingers lingered in his for a moment before she withdrew, a flush coloring her cheeks. "We should tell Eliza the good news," she said, calling her daughter over. The child's delight at learning they wouldn't have to leave was heartwarming. As Eliza danced around the yard in celebration, Bryce found himself imagining a future where such moments were commonplace, where the three of them were truly a family, not just employer and employees. The daydream was abruptly shattered by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property, and Bryce recognized Barrett's men from the previous day. Their grim expressions suggested this wasn't a social call. "Get inside," Bryce told Lillian, his voice low and urgent. "Take Eliza to the main house and lock the doors." "What are you going to do?" "Have a conversation," he said grimly. "Go now." As Lillian hurried Eliza toward the house, Bryce walked to meet the approaching riders. His rifle was in the barn, too far to retrieve without appearing threatening. Instead, he kept his stance relaxed but alert, one hand resting near the knife at his belt. "Gentlemen," he called as they drew closer. "Mr. Barrett isn't with you today?" The lead rider, a hard-faced man with a scar running along his jaw, sneered down at him. "Mr. Barrett sends his regards. And a message. I'm listening. He says time's up. The woman and her kid leave with us today, or there'll be consequences." Bryce stood his ground. "Mrs. Wilson isn't going anywhere. We have a court order preventing Barrett from removing her from the territory, and we're prepared to pay whatever legitimate debt exists, with proper documentation, of course." The scarred man laughed, an ugly sound. "Court orders don't mean much out here, boy. And Mr. Barrett isn't interested in negotiations anymore." "That's unfortunate," Bryce replied evenly. "Because negotiation is all he's going to get. We'll see about that." The man nodded to his companions, who began to spread out, flanking Bryce. "Mr. Barrett figured you might be difficult. Said to make an example if necessary." Bryce assessed his options rapidly. 3 against 1, and they were mounted while he was on foot. Not good odds. But he'd grown up on this land, knew every dip and hollow, every structure that could provide cover. "Last chance," the leader said. "Step aside and let us collect the woman and her brat." "Not happening," Bryce replied, his voice hardening. "And if you call her daughter that again, you'll regret it." The leader's expression darkened. "Have it your way." He made a sharp gesture to his companions. "Teach him some manners, boys. But leave enough of him breathing to watch us take the woman." What happened next unfolded with startling speed. As the men dismounted and advanced, Bryce backed toward the water trough, keeping all 3 in sight. The first man lunged with a wild swing that Bryce easily sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him stumbling into the trough with a tremendous splash. The second attacker was more careful, circling warily before feinting left and striking right. Bryce caught the blow on his forearm, wincing at the impact, then countered with a sharp jab to the man's midsection that drove the air from his lungs. But the leader was quicker than his companions, and while Bryce was engaged with the second man, he struck from behind. Pain exploded across Bryce's back as something heavy, likely a pistol, but connected with his kidney. He stumbled forward, fighting to stay upright as spots danced before his vision. The next few minutes blurred into a desperate struggle. Bryce managed to land several solid blows, but he was outnumbered and rapidly tiring. A punch to his jaw sent him reeling, and as he tried to regain his footing, a boot connected with his ribs, dropping him to one knee. Not so tough now. Are you, rancher? The leader taunted, grabbing a fistful of Bryce's hair to force his head up. Once we're done with you, we'll see how the lady likes. The crack of a rifle shot cut through the air, startlingly loud in the open yard. The leader froze, then slowly released Bryce and turned toward the sound. Lillian stood on the porch of the main house, Bryce's rifle steady in her hands. The barrel was aimed directly at the leader's chest, and from the determination in her stance, it was clear she knew how to use it. The next one won't go over your head, she called, her voice remarkably calm. Step away from him. All of you. The leader raised his hand slowly. Now, ma'am, there's no need for that. We're just delivering a message from Mr. Barrett. I've heard enough of Mr. Barrett's messages. Lillian's grip on the rifle never wavered. Sheriff Tanner is on his way. I sent Eliza to the Hendersons' farm to fetch him before you arrived. It was a bluff. Bryce knew the Hendersons lived too far for Eliza to have gone and returned with the sheriff already. But the men didn't know that, and the mention of law enforcement clearly gave them pause. This isn't over, the leader snarled, backing toward his horse. Barrett won't stop until he gets what's his. I was never his, Lillian replied, her voice like steel. And he'll never touch my daughter. Now get off this property before I decide Wyoming has 3 less vermin to worry about. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the willingness to pull the trigger, convinced the men. They mounted their horses with muttered threats and rode off, dust billowing in their wake. As soon as they were out of sight, Lillian lowered the rifle and rushed to Bryce's side. Are you hurt badly? She asked, helping him to his feet. Nothing permanent, he managed, though his ribs protested sharply as he straightened. Where's Eliza? In the root cellar. I told her to stay hidden until I came for her. Lillian's hands were gentle as she examined the cut on his cheek. I lied about sending her for the sheriff. I figured. Bryce winced as he took a deeper breath. But it was quick thinking. They'll be back, Lillian said quietly. With more men next time. Probably, Bryce agreed. But we'll be ready. Ready how? Barrett won't stop, and I can't ask you to fight all his battles. Lillian's voice cracked slightly. You could have been killed today. So could you, Bryce pointed out. But you came out anyway. With my rifle, no less. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I grew up on a farm in Ohio. My father taught all his daughters to shoot. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Bryce said, attempting humor despite his aching body. Lillian's smile faded as she studied his injuries. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Barrett's men won't hesitate to burn this place to the ground if he orders it. Then we need to make sure he can't give that order. Bryce took her hand, his expression serious. The letter you wrote, the one with everything you know about Barrett's operations. Would you be willing to give it to Sheriff Tanner? Lillian hesitated, fear evident in her eyes. If Barrett found out I was informing on him. He already knows you're opposing him, Bryce said gently. The information might be enough for the authorities to arrest him, especially with the Chicago investigation already underway. For a long moment, Lillian said nothing, internal conflict clear on her face. Then her expression hardened with resolve. I'll do it. Not just for us, but for all the others he's threatened and exploited. Us, she'd said. The simple word carried worlds of meaning. As they made their way toward the house to retrieve Eliza from her hiding place, Bryce knew they had reached a turning point. The next few days would determine not just Lillian and Eliza's fate, but the future of whatever was growing between him and this remarkable woman who had shown such unexpected courage. What neither of them could anticipate was how quickly events would escalate, or that Barrett's desperation would drive him to a final, dangerous confrontation that would forever change all their lives. Sheriff Tanner arrived at the ranch the following morning, having received Bryce's urgent message about Barrett's men. His expression grew grave as he examined Bryce's injuries and listened to their account of the confrontation. Assault, trespassing, attempted kidnapping. Tanner ticked off on his fingers. That's more than enough to hold Barrett's men, if we can find them. They'll be wherever Barrett is, Bryce said, wincing as Lillian applied a cold compress to his bruised jaw. Probably at the hotel in town. I'll handle them, Tanner assured him. But Barrett himself is the real problem. Without solid evidence of his criminal activities, the most I can charge him with is hiring men who broke the law. Lillian exchanged a glance with Bryce, then stood and crossed to her cabin. She returned moments later with a sealed envelope. This contains everything I know about Barrett's operations in Chicago, she explained, handing it to Tanner. Names, dates, locations. The businesses he uses as fronts for gambling and prostitution. The officials he's bribed. Tanner's eyebrows rose as he accepted the envelope. This is exactly what the Chicago authorities have been looking for. You're sure you're willing to stand behind this information? Might mean testifying if it comes to trial. I'm sure, Lillian said firmly. I'm done letting fear of that man control my life. Good for you, Mrs. Wilson. Tanner tucked the envelope securely inside his vest. I'll wire Chicago immediately. With any luck, we'll have an arrest warrant for Barrett within days. What about until then? Bryce asked. His men made it clear they'd be back. I can post a deputy here, but I won't lie to you. We're stretched thin. Tanner's expression was apologetic. Best I can suggest is that you all stay vigilant and keep weapons handy. After the sheriff departed, Bryce and Lillian sat in troubled silence while Eliza played with the carved animals, blissfully unaware of the dangers surrounding them. Perhaps we should go stay in town, Lillian suggested. At least there would be people around. Barrett has more influence there than here, Bryce countered. And the ranch is defensible, limited approaches, good sight lines. He reached for her hand. I won't let anything happen to you or Eliza, Lillian. I promise you that. The intensity in his voice caught her off guard. She studied his face, the determined set of his jaw, the earnestness in his eyes. This young man who'd known her barely a month was willing to risk everything to protect her and her daughter. Why? She asked softly. Why do all this for us? The truth, Bryce. He held her gaze steadily. Because from the moment that little girl climbed up my hill asking for help, something changed. And when I met you, he paused, searching for words. I've been alone since my mother died. Before that, really. Running this ranch, existing day to day without really living. Then suddenly there was music in the house again, and laughter, and meals that weren't just for sustenance. He squeezed her hand gently. I know it's fast, probably too fast, but I care for you, Lillian. And for Eliza, more than I thought possible in such a short time. Lillian felt tears gathering, unexpected and unwelcome. We've brought nothing but trouble to your door. That's not true, Bryce said firmly. You've brought life back to this place. To me. The raw honesty in his voice stripped away her carefully maintained barriers. I care for you too, she admitted quietly. More than is wise, given our circumstances. A cautious smile spread across Bryce's face, transforming it despite the bruises. Our circumstances can change. Once Barrett is dealt with, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Lillian interrupted gently. One crisis at a time. Bryce nodded, though the hope in his eyes remained undimmed. Fair enough. They spent the rest of the day preparing for potential trouble, checking weapons, securing doors and windows, establishing a plan for Eliza's safety if Barrett's men returned. By nightfall, the ranch was as ready as they could make it. Bryce insisted on sleeping in the barn rather than the main house, positioning himself where he could observe both cabins. Despite Lillian's concerns about his injuries, he was adamant about standing guard. I'll be fine, he assured her. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll ride into town together and see about that warrant. But Barrett had no intention of waiting for the law to catch up with him. Shortly after midnight, the quiet of the ranch was shattered by the frantic barking of Bryce's dog, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. Bryce bolted awake, instantly alert. Through the barn door, he could see flames licking at the corner of the foreman's cabin where Lillian and Eliza slept. Without hesitation, he grabbed his rifle and ran toward the fire, shouting Lillian's name. The cabin door burst open, and Lillian emerged, clutching a terrified Eliza in her arms. Barrett's men, she gasped as she reached Bryce. I saw them through the window. Get to the main house, Bryce ordered, guiding them toward the larger structure. Barricade yourselves inside. What about you? I'll deal with the fire, then find them. His expression was grim in the flickering light. Go now. As Lillian and Eliza ran for the safety of the main house, Bryce turned his attention to the growing flames. The fire hadn't taken hold fully yet, concentrated at one corner of the small cabin. Using buckets from the nearby well, he managed to douse the worst of it, though smoke still billowed from the scorched wood. He was so focused on the task that he didn't hear the approach until it was almost too late. A warning bark from his dog saved him, giving him just enough time to drop the bucket and dive sideways as a shot rang out, splintering the wood where he'd been standing. Rolling behind the water trough, Bryce brought his rifle up and scanned the darkness. 3 shapes moved among the shadows near the corral, Barrett's men returning as promised, this time with lethal intent. You're trespassing on private property, Bryce called out, hoping against hope that they might still be reasoned with. The sheriff knows you're here. A mocking laugh answered him. Sheriff's 10 miles away, came the reply, the scarred leader from before. Plenty of time to finish our business and be gone. What does Barrett hope to accomplish with this? Bryce demanded, trying to keep them talking while he assessed his options. Even if you kill me, you can't take Mrs. Wilson against her will. The whole territory will be looking for you. Who said anything about taking her? The voice was closer now, circling to Bryce's left. Barrett's changed his mind. Says if he can't have her, no one will. Especially not some upstart rancher. Cold dread washed over Bryce at the implications. They weren't here to abduct Lillian. They were here to kill all of them. With renewed urgency, he fired a warning shot toward the voice, gratified to hear a curse as the man ducked for cover. Last chance to ride out of here, Bryce shouted. Next one won't miss. The answer came in the form of gunfire, bullets thudding into the wooden trough and kicking up dirt around him. Bryce returned fire carefully, conserving ammunition while trying to keep the attackers pinned down away from the main house. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Bryce knew he was outnumbered but had the benefit of knowing the terrain. If he could just hold them off until daylight, when visibility would improve. A scream from the direction of the main house shattered his concentration. Lillian's voice, high with terror. Without thinking, Bryce broke from his cover, racing toward the sound. He realized his mistake too late. The scream hadn't come from the house at all. It had been a ruse to draw him out. As he cleared the corner of the barn, a crushing blow caught him from behind, driving him to his knees. His rifle went flying, and rough hands yanked his arms behind his back. Not so clever after all, the scarred man sneered, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Bryce's temple. Now, let's go pay a visit to your lady friend. Bryce struggled furiously against their grip, but a second blow left him dazed, barely able to stay conscious as they dragged him toward the main house. Lillian, he managed to shout, his voice weaker than he intended. They're coming. Get out. A brutal backhand silenced him. Shut your mouth, or I'll put a bullet in you right now. As they approached the house, Bryce fought to clear his head, desperately trying to think of a way out. The main house had a back door. If Lillian had heard his warning, she might have been able to escape with Eliza through the kitchen and make for the neighbor's place. The scarred man pounded on the front door. Mrs. Wilson, come out now, or your employer dies right here. Silence answered him. The man nodded to one of his companions, who moved to peer through the window. Can't see nothing, he reported. Too dark inside. Break it down, the leader ordered, pressing his gun harder against Bryce's head. Find them. The third man stepped back to kick at the door, but before his boot could connect, a thunderous boom shattered the night. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg as blood darkened his trousers. The front door flew open, and Sheriff Tanner stood in the doorway, shotgun leveled at the remaining attackers. Drop your weapons, he barked. Now, behind him, Lillian appeared, holding Bryce's spare pistol with unwavering aim. For a suspended moment, no one moved. Then the scarred man yanked Bryce up, using him as a shield. Back off, Sheriff, or he's dead. You're surrounded, Fletcher, Tanner replied evenly. Barrett sold you out. Told us exactly where to find you in exchange for leniency. You're lying, Fletcher snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Am I? Why do you think I was waiting here instead of in town? Tanner kept his shotgun steady. Barrett's already in custody. Game's over. Fletcher's grip tightened painfully on Bryce's arm as he processed this betrayal. His remaining companion looked nervously between Fletcher and the sheriff, clearly calculating his chances. "Don't do anything stupid," Tanner warned. "You're looking at assault and attempted murder already. Don't make it worse." The tense standoff stretched for what seemed an eternity. Then, with a muttered curse, Fletcher shoved Bryce forward and made a desperate lunge toward the darkness. He never made it. Lillian's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Before he could recover, Tanner was on him, driving him to the ground with the butt of the shotgun. The remaining attacker immediately threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. As deputies emerged from the shadows to secure the prisoners, Lillian rushed to Bryce's side. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands gentle as they examined his new injuries. "Nothing serious," he assured her, though his head was pounding and his vision still blurry around the edges. "Eliza?" "Safe. Mrs. Henderson came for her hours ago." Lillian's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Sheriff Tanner arrived just after you fell asleep. He'd received a telegram from Chicago. They issued the arrest warrant for Barrett." "So it's over?" Bryce asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Truly over?" "Barrett is in custody," Tanner confirmed, approaching them after handing Fletcher off to his deputies. "Chicago authorities are sending someone to escort him back for trial. With Mrs. Wilson's testimony and the evidence we found in his hotel room, he'll be locked away for a very long time." Relief washed over Bryce, so profound it left him momentarily speechless. He reached for Lillian's hand, needing the anchor of her touch to believe this nightmare had truly ended. "Thank you," Lillian said to Tanner, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. Just doing my job, ma'am." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Though I must say, that was some fine shooting earlier. Where'd you learn to handle a pistol like that?" A small smile touched Lillian's lips. "The same place I learned to use a rifle. My father believed his daughters should be able to protect themselves." "Wise man," Tanner commented. "Well, I'd better get these fellows to jail. Deputies will be back in the morning to take your official statements." He glanced at Bryce's injuries. "Might want to have the doc look at that head of yours, Vance." After the sheriff and his prisoners had departed, Bryce and Lillian sat on the porch steps, watching as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky. The burned corner of the foreman's cabin stood as a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "It needs to be rebuilt anyway," Bryce said, following her gaze. "It was always too small for you and Eliza." Lillian turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Are you asking us to stay then, now that the danger is past?" "I'm asking for more than that," Bryce said quietly. He took her hands in his expression earnest despite his battered appearance. "I know it hasn't been long, and maybe this is too forward, but these weeks have shown me what I want for my future. Who I want in my future." Lillian's breath caught. "Bryce, I'm not proposing marriage, not yet," he clarified, a smile touching his lips. "That would be too much, too soon. But I am asking for a chance to court you properly, to build something real between us, to see if what I feel, what I hope you feel too, can grow into something lasting." Lillian was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his. "What about your reputation? People will talk." "Let them," Bryce said simply. "What matters is what's true. And what's true is that in the short time you and Eliza have been here, you've become more important to me than what anyone in town might say." Tears spilled onto Lillian's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Then yes. Yes to staying. Yes to this chance." Bryce's heart soared. With gentle care for his injuries, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a first kiss that carried the promise of many more to come. As they sat together watching the sunrise, Bryce knew there would be challenges ahead. A ranch to rebuild and expand. A courtship to navigate under the watchful eyes of a small community. A young girl to raise and nurture. But for the first time since his mother's death, perhaps for the first time ever, he wasn't facing the future alone. All because a determined little girl had climbed his hill one Tuesday morning, asking a rancher to save her mother from working in town. 1 year later, the wildflowers were in full bloom across the rolling Wyoming hills as Bryce and Lillian exchanged their vows beneath the ancient oak tree that marked the highest point of the ranch. Eliza stood proudly at her mother's side, her once tattered dress replaced by a confection of lace and ribbons, her smile wide enough to rival the June sunshine. The ranch had transformed as dramatically as their lives. Cooper's investment had proven fruitful beyond expectations, allowing Bryce to triple his herd and build a new, larger cabin to replace the burned foreman's quarters. The main house had been expanded too, with a proper music room where Lillian's piano, a wedding gift from the grateful citizens of Wheatland, now took pride of place. For Barrett's downfall had brought unexpected benefits to the community. His testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, had exposed corruption reaching into the highest offices of the territory. The resulting cleanup had left Wheatland with honest leadership and a new appreciation for the woman whose courage had set the events in motion. As Sheriff Tanner pronounced them husband and wife, Bryce cupped Lillian's face in his hands with a tenderness that still took her breath away. "I love you, Mrs. Vance," he whispered. "And I love you," she replied, her eyes shining with joy. "More than I once thought possible." Later, as the celebration continued under lantern light and stars, Eliza tugged at Bryce's sleeve, her expression serious despite the festivities. "Does this mean I should call you Pa now?" she asked, the directness of childhood cutting to the heart of matters. Bryce knelt to her level, the way he had on that first morning when she'd appeared on his porch. "Only if you want to, Eliza. But know this, whether you call me Bryce or Pa or anything else, I promise to love and protect you always, just as I will your mother." Eliza considered this solemnly, then nodded. "I think Pa suits you," she decided, "especially since Mama says we might have a baby brother or sister soon." Bryce's eyes widened as he glanced up at Lillian, who blushed beautifully. "I was going to tell you tonight," she admitted. "Eliza, darling, that was supposed to be a secret." The child shrugged, unrepentant. Secrets are hard. As laughter rippled through their small circle of family and friends, Bryce felt a completeness he'd never known possible. From loss and loneliness had come this unexpected gift, a wife who matched him in courage and conviction, a daughter who delighted him with her spirit, and now the promise of new life to come. All because a little girl had asked a rancher to save her mother from working in town.